Hi, I'm Livia Kent, Editor-in-Chief of Psychotherapy Networker. You're about to hear a discussion between Dr. Ramani Durvasula, a leading expert in narcissism and narcissistic abuse, and Kory Andreas, a leading expert in autism and neurodivergent couples. Many of you are probably wondering why we're even exploring autism and narcissism in the same conversation. Other than both being words that are growing more and more ubiquitous in our culture, they have nothing to do with one another. One is a neurotype that exists on a spectrum with vast presentations of its challenges and strengths. And the other is an antagonistic personality style that's hugely damaging to relationships. So why are these two experts with such very different clinical specialties coming together to meet today? The answer is that they're both concerned about the confusion they're seeing around certain behaviors that can be damaging for relational partners, but can have very different root causes and have very different prospects for change. In her neurodivergent couples therapy practice, Kory is seeing a lot of partners of autistic adults feeling helpless and hopeless, maybe thanks to social media, because they've misunderstood some of their partner's behaviors as rooted in narcissism rather than autism. And in the groups of survivors of narcissistic abuse that Dr. Ramani runs, she's seeing that actual narcissistic partners are falsely claiming that their harmful behaviors are rooted in autism, not narcissism, which can really complicate the healing process for somebody struggling to make sense of a narcissistic relationship. Today, we're going to discuss why this is happening, why it matters, and what we can do about it. This is a tricky conversation, and frankly, it was a little tricky for me to facilitate. So before we dive in, I want to make a few things clear. First, the presentation of autism we're focusing on here is in high-masking autistic adults, or individuals with low support needs, many of whom probably weren't diagnosed until late in life, and as a result, may carry a lot of trauma from being misunderstood and unaccommodated for so long. Second, just because we're having this conversation does not mean that we're implying that every high-masking autistic adult, and it's typically men they talk about in this conversation, exhibits harmful behaviors toward their partners. That is not the case at all. Rather, we're exploring certain behaviors that can show up in neurodivergent relationships that may look similar to certain behaviors that do show up in narcissistic relationships, and therefore are often misunderstood by partners and sometimes even therapists. Correcting that misunderstanding can make a dramatic difference in people's lives, and that's what we're attempting to do here. Most autistic adults have a strong sense of justice and fairness. They are not looking to control a partner or shut down emotional conversations or put up walls or erupt in anger over seemingly small things. They may not even be aware of how much they're masking at work, for example, and how that affects their nervous system when they come home to a partner. But when both partners in a neurodivergent relationship are committed to learning about the autistic brain and making accommodations, there's a lot of room for growth and change, and that's what Kory focuses on in her practice. However, when these same behaviors are rooted in narcissism, there's very little chance of change. And making accommodations only gets a partner deeper in what can be a soul-crushing cycle of abuse. And that's what Dr. Ramani focuses on in her practice. So you'll hear them discuss things like the misconstrued question of empathy, rejection sensitivity, trauma, and how we can untangle controlling from rigid and pattern-seeking behaviors. So know that as we get started, we're opening the door to something complicated and nuanced, and it's an ongoing conversation we hope you'll engage with. Kory, let's start with you. Why would some of the high masking people you see in your practice get mislabeled? Not in your practice, but get mislabeled as narcissists?
Yeah, I think a lot of my clients get mislabeled as having a narcissistic personality because oftentimes their behaviors can be misunderstood, while some of the behaviors sometimes of a dysregulated autistic adult who wasn't identified in childhood or is, needing to work on emotional regulation and things like that, they can look very similar to some of the behaviors you might see from someone with a narcissistic personality. So I think on the surface, sometimes behaviorally things are showing up without the context to make them make sense. And quite honestly, narcissism is a topic that I think a lot of people are hearing in the media. It's becoming more mainstream to use that word, and sometimes inappropriately so. So I think there's a lot of confusion over what that really means and how that is distinct from what we're seeing with autistic adults.
Dr. Ramani, in your side, what are you seeing in your survivor groups around the issue
Mhm.
of autism?
Well, it's interesting. I think that there's a couple of things. One thing that many survivors struggle with, because listen, at the face of it, a lot of survivors, if we let's stay focused on intimate relationships for a moment, there's an investment in the relationship, even though it's become very unhealthy, right? Because they may have minor children together. There's a history together. There's a financial interdependence. There's some days in there that actually feel good and like they're all, part of something and that aren't as emotionally harmful or abusive. So a couple of things are happening. Just as the word narcissistic is often getting overused in the internet landscape, so too now is the word autism and autistic. And for whatever reason, and I think there's a whole host of reasons, many partners feel like, well, if my partner's autistic, then there's hope, right? As though, well, narcissism, we know narcissistic personality is not unique in its inflexibility. All personalities have some element of inflexibility to them. That's why there are personalities. They're a consistent sort of measure of how a person shows up. There's some modifiability, but it's pretty small. The more antagonistic the style, the less amenable it is to change. And usually we see two main drivers of personality change: head injury or post trauma. Okay, so we can't create those conditions. So those might, and then not necessarily always in the direction we want the personality change to happen either. So what's happening is because there is I think again, the armchair characterization of a person with, as you termed it, high masking autism. So we may not be seeing an autistic individual who's having, for example, gross motor deficits or is having issues with verbal functioning. So we're not seeing those things happening alongside it, but rather shifts in empathy that a person doesn't feel as seen in the relationship or impulsivity in the relationship, that there is a sense that, well, what if I'm wrong? What if my partner is indeed autistic and not narcissistic? Number one. Number two, the partners are using this word. Like, you can't be mad at me. I talked to a psychologist and they told me I'm autistic. So, this is just who I am. That often brings up a tremendous amount of guilt and more confusion than the survivors in these relationships already had, who are now coming to me and saying, what if my partner's autistic and I'm actually angry at somebody for a really a neurotype, for something that's very different than a personality style. And obviously they're not the same thing, but I think that just as the internet will always, plop new words in there without sufficient explanation, that's what I'm sort of seeing here is a confusion about some of the overlaps, and then a guilt, grief, concern by people in these relationships that maybe I'm reading this wrong and I'm being reactive. And the worst thing is a lot of folks in these relationships are saying, oh my gosh, this confirms that I'm a bad person. I'm in a relationship with someone autistic and I thought bad things about them. And some people are even going more underground and becoming more isolated because they feel like they're stigmatizing a partner further who is managing something, and that and so the partner is now, I'm going to try harder. I'm going to try harder. Well, if it ain't autism, all that trying harder is just going to keep a person more stuck.
Right. So if you're not, if autism is not it's not at play, then you're just further embedding yourself into a cycle of narcissistic abuse.
Correct.
Kory, you see in your practice couples in which one partner is autistic, sometimes both, but how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting way to look at this from both sides because on my end, many people are coming to me certain that their partners are narcissistic
Mm.
when there are actually many kind of green flags of autism. And the difference being, I think, underlying all the behaviors that probably cross over in the middle is that I think a lot of people are realizing in therapy that is focusing on, neurodivergent affirming strategies, if it is autism, the core of what's driving these behaviors is completely different.
Mm.
And I think what is really frustrating as a therapist and just kind of in the world of other professionals is that we were not trained on any of this. Like the neurodivergent landscape has dramatically taken a 180 in the last 5, 10 years, where this presentation of high masking autism didn't exist a few years ago. So not only were we untrained on it in school, we're not even really getting great continued education about it. So, we're kind of left with the internet, both as consumers of therapy and as therapists as well. So when you really look at these behaviors on the surface, I think Dr. Ramani and I are both in alignment that some of these behaviors that cross over are really unacceptable. And they're not pro-social. They're not leading to a healthy, fair, balanced partnership. But oftentimes, some of the reasons for those behaviors are because this generation was lost in getting help and getting, assessments and getting identified. And so, some of the things we're seeing are partly trauma, due to kind of being in a world that wasn't built for them. So I think, what I'm always looking to understand more and why I'm so excited to be sitting with Dr. Romney is understanding more of, what is the other presentation? Like, how are we able to look at these behaviors and get to know these couples, and understand that we need to know what we're looking at before we're able to help, because, the outcomes here will be completely different. And I certainly am not looking to say that every partnership that is in a neurodiverse relationship should stay together. And many times, they don't. But understanding where some of these behaviors are coming from is really important if we are going to figure out if there's hope to change or if we're looking at radical acceptance or looking at a split.
So we keep saying the term these behaviors. So I think for the sake of our viewers, maybe let's look a little bit at what we mean when we say these behaviors, and we can talk about from either of you, where kind of pick up the rock and look look at what's underneath, what's driving these behaviors, and what that means in the larger picture. So I I hesitate to start with what in my view is kind of the most complicated seeming overlap, and that's this perception of lack of empathy. Um, Dr. Ramani, let's start with you when it comes to the empathy factor and narcissism. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that looks like?
I mean, even lack of empathy is already, we're already in hazardous condition, because a narcissistic person doesn't lack empathy, not at all. They wouldn't be as socially successful as they are if they did. So narcissistic people have low empathy. They have variable empathy. They have performative empathy. They have cognitive empathy, and they have transactional empathy. And these things, if you don't know what you're looking for, or you're not some sort of empathy scholar, you don't know how to read it. Right. And so the reason I don't say lack, because lack really, it implies an absence, something we'd see more in a condition like psychopathy or really severe malignant presentations of narcissism. But this low variable cognitive empathy means that on a day when a narcissistic person feels well regulated, things are going their way, the way they want them to, they got the promotion they wanted, they got the parking spot they wanted, they got the number of likes they wanted on an Instagram post, they got money in their pocket, whatever it is, they may be whistling a happy tune. Okay. On that day, the partner could approach them and share something that happened at work. And then the narcissistic partner may actually give a response that feels connected to what they shared. It might even be something as cognitive as, wow, that's hard. I understand why you feel that way. That's still in a cognitive response, but most people, like I said, aren't empathy scholars to understand that, instead the empathic response would be, that's hard. How are you feeling? Tell me more, because that was tough. And then hearing the feeling, right? But it's more of an, I understand. Nonetheless, it still feels good. Now, if that narcissistic person the next day doesn't get the parking spot or the Instagram likes or the promotion or something goes wrong, that exact same conversation, something's happened at work, could be like, oh my gosh, you are so selfish. Why is this relationship always about you? And so the partner, thinking that this person does have empathy, will sometimes go into the next day thinking they do. So the variability goes with the regulation and the sort of sense of, I'm getting validated enough from the world that the narcissistic person feels stable. The narcissistic person also knows that empathy is a valuable social characteristic. Narcissistic people, by definition, are actually quite socially perceptive. They understand what people want. They can read it. They can even mirror it. It is why they are so charismatic, that they are actually absolutely very enticing leaders for a moment in time. They're successful politicians. They're very successful salespeople because they have such a capacity to very quickly and strategically go in, be aware of what the other person wants, and know what empathy, it's valued. So they'll put on a very empathic show in front of an audience. But when they're with that person alone behind closed doors, the empathy's gone because it's not serving its transactional function. And I'm saying all of this because the low variable empathy drives some of the most problematic behaviors in the narcissistic relationship. The invalidation, the hot and cold of the relationship, the not feeling seen, the not feeling heard, all of those things tend to draw from this well of low empathy. And so you feel like you're playing a slot machine when you're in one of these relationships. Like, are we going to have a good day or not? And ultimately that drives things like hypervigilance, disappointment, and then ultimately self-blame in the partners of narcissistic people.
So, Dr. Ramani, can I ask you a question about that? That sounds to me like a familiar dynamic that I also hear from neurodiverse couples where they will describe it as a push-pull feeling, where, at times it feels like empathy, they will use the term empathy, is, flowing freely and things are easy and there's a lot of caretaking and things like that. And then it seems to sort of just get shut off. And I think what you are describing is such an interesting way of looking at the why of that. Whereas with neurodiverse couples, what we often see is it has more to do with regulation, where there's no manipulation behind it. It's not for benefit, it's not for power, but it is driven by the person exhibiting that push-pull having a lack of resources to keep their nervous system online. So they're out of energy, they're out of ability to deal with their emotions. They were having a highly social day and now really have nothing to give. And then the behaviors that come after that are not healthy. So I would imagine for the person who is the partner, that push-pull feels the same no matter what the reason for it. So I had something, this person was safe, they were caring for me, I thought they were someone I could rely on, and now that's gone. Where did it go? Would you say that that's like a similar?
It's very similar. And I actually have to say it probably also is a regulation issue. I mean, Livia, a point you had brought up is this issue, and also you had brought this up too, Kory, is this issue of trauma and regulation. Many, many people, personality theoreticians, clinicians would argue in many cases, if not most, narcissism is a post-traumatic state. And inherent in that is going to be dysregulation. That is a classical part of any trauma picture. And you had said, Kory, that for many autistic people, the trauma is of being neurodivergent in a world that was not at all able to support, hold, or accommodate to any of that. And for the narcissistic person, this is more likely to have been adverse childhood events, early childhood chaos, disruptions in attachment, lack of attunement, expectations without support, those sorts of things, not to mention temperament as being part of that, right? So what then happens though is I think that, those mechanisms sound familiar. So right from there, I would tell you, I don't know that we have a discernment point here. Like, you're talking about people who are sometimes regulated and sometimes not. The narcissistic people are sometimes not regulated because not necessarily because of overwhelm, Kory, which is what I'm hearing you say. For the narcissistic person, it's disappointment. The world didn't deliver what they felt entitled to, whether it was validation, acclaim, praise, ease, that basically their superiority and their specialness was not mirrored the way they wanted from the world. Now, another tricky part is none of us do well on a bad day, right? If we had a bad day, a lot of us would come home and be a little bit grumpy. the whole thing, the issue with narcissism, and again, an overlap with autism, is a lack of self-reflective capacity and poor mentalization, the inability to easily and reflexively step into a place of understanding what the other person's experience is of what they're doing. But here's the place where I think you do have sort of a discriminant kind of a tipping point. If the person who was in the narcissistic relationship said to the person who is now being quite unkind to them on the next day, says, I see, I get it. Today you're more dysregulated. There's a lot going on in at work. There was a lot, you had a lot happen today. It seems like the best thing we could do is maybe go take a break. The narcissistic person is going to feel patronized, insulted, devalued. How dare you tell me, you're the problem, you're the problem. So it's not going to go to a willingness to say, oh, they're meeting me on something I might need here, and recognizing that I may have had a day that sort of pushed me, but rather would lash out at the partner for pointing out their imperfection, pointing out their weakness, and would shift the blame onto the partner, saying, I do great at work. Everyone, I have no problem with anyone at work, but I come home to you and it's this.
Well,
To me, that feels different.
That brings up another seeming overlap I do want to get to. And before we go to what we've kind of been terming the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde overlap, Kory, I want to allow you a little bit of space to talk about empathy and autism, because that gets a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in autism, there's a huge misconception that autistic people do not feel empathy. And I think that's a lot of people feel really offended by that because it's talked about in a really mainstream way. And even when we're talking about children, that's often one of the first things that parents will say when they come in, that, my child does not exhibit empathy and they don't care about how other kids feel. So there's a lot of misunderstandings around that. The one thing that is, pretty common is that the cognitive empathy is something that needs to be taught. It needs to be supported. It needs to be encouraged. And what that means is there is a lack of understanding of perspective. So, if I am not bothered by something that someone else is bothered by, it's going to be hard for me to understand until I can make a bridge between those two experiences. Oh, okay. So when I'm loud and you don't, see that coming, it makes you feel really off in your body. Oh, I can relate to that. That's what it's like when I smell something that's really off. So really what most autistic people are doing that are high masking are constantly making these connections. I don't understand why that bothers you, but I can understand that your reaction is similar to this thing that bothers me. So it's a self-focus, not self-centered, not selfish, but we understand the world in terms of ourselves, and then we apply that to others in order to connect with that empathy. So autistic people want to understand that. They want to connect that. They deeply feel. Actually, most autistic people are, in fact, shut down because they feel so deeply. And what you're actually seeing with some of the mismatches in communication is that you're seeing someone who is feeling so much, so deeply, so intensely in a moment that they cannot pull it apart to understand where to start, or they don't know the first step, or they don't know the right thing to say, or someone has given you a gift and you can't imagine words making someone understand the way that this has made you feel. So you say nothing. So many, many, many partners, parents, friends will say, they don't care, because what it looks like on the surface is they didn't say anything. They're behaving in a way that was unexpected, and it seems to others that they don't care, when often there's a lot more going on than that. So the cognitive empathy responds very well to therapy that is focused on autism. So when we work with people, we're working on perspective taking. So, I certainly understand that this doesn't make sense to you based on how you are impacted by these things. However, can we do a little, exercise in perspective taking to understand where your partner might be coming from, knowing them like you do, what might be triggering them? And that does greatly improve with therapy, greatly improve. So once that connection is made, it becomes an intellectual process, which autistic people are phenomenal at. So they felt it, but they had to categorize it and they had to learn how to respond. So I see huge, huge changes in couples when we start addressing what it looks like and what it actually feels like on the inside. So a lot of people don't even have the language before they go to therapy, because we have generations of undiagnosed autistic families that weren't teaching these skills. We weren't teaching anything about emotions. The There was no feelings wheel a generation ago for kids to refer to. So cognitive empathy is something that improves in therapy. The other piece is the affective empathy, which is, what we're feeling. And you do see, especially in women and gender diverse individuals, we see a ton of hyper empathy, feeling everything in the room, every emotion in the room, but maybe don't know where it's coming from. We don't know what we've done to offend everyone, but we can tell that people are offended. You watch a movie and you're sobbing over a, cartoon character. There's a tremendous amount of empathy. But I think the biggest one that stands out as a strength for autistic people, which even couples that I work with that are really struggling will acknowledge is a real strength, is that compassionate empathy. It's the doing. So it's, taking care of one another around the house, showing up with a cup of coffee consistently, taking care of, taking out the garbage, making sure that you have the food that you need to eat. Most autistic people who exhibit some of these behaviors that look really similar to narcissism, often the majority of the time are showing a lot of compassionate empathy in behaviors that make sense, that are predictable. And once they learn a rule, they're going to carry it through.
Interesting.
So, if I know you like your coffee at 6 a.m., you're going to get coffee at 6 a.m. every day without exception.
Interesting.
And they often don't understand the deficits or the complaints that are coming from partners when they say you don't care. They're like, I'm showing you I care. I'm showing you all day that I care, but it's different ways of understanding care.
Yeah.
Yes. So, a little like, what does this look like on the outside? That could go either way. Just to give, put a point in it. A partner comes home from work, they're having a bad day. Maybe, they want a hug or something. The other partner pushes them away. The partner gets upset. You might hear something like, oh, here it comes again. You're going to start crying. Then you're going to do that thing with your eyebrows and start to tell me all the things that I did wrong. Then you're going to twist my words around and I'll tell you to stop doing that. And then you'll shut down and we're going to fight for 2 days. It happens every time. And then the walking out of the room. So that kind of looks like a lack of empathy, but I think you could read it. This is like shutting down, devaluing, demeaning, or this is Kory just pattern seeing.
And the reality is it's often true. How many couples do we work with where we're having the same fight? We're having the same interaction over and over and over again, the same power struggles. So, when someone says you do this every time, we hate to hear that in therapy and we try to get away from these absolutes, but oftentimes there is data. And so autistic brains need that data to make sense of the argument. We need to understand what's coming next. And there's a need to prepare yourself for the unpredictable. And conflict is not something that autistic people typically do well because there's a lot of pattern seeking, yes, but unpredictability. And the thing that makes you the most distraught in an argument is the unpredictability. There's a lot of emotions. There's a lot of things being thrown at you in real time, super fast. And that kind of emotional processing takes time for autistic brains. We need to pull it apart. We need to understand. We need to make sense of it. And most people can't do that in real time in a fight to keep up with a neurotypical partner.
Right. And so even with the compassionate empathy, you bring up such an interesting point, Kory. Like, for example, once the pattern is taught, understood, appreciated, there isn't contempt for the partner, right? There isn't the contempt that this is something you need. There might be almost like okay. There's like a taking a relief and like, oh, this is what you do. And then the thing is done. And maybe even to a fault, like you're like, okay, on Saturday and Sunday, let's turn off that 6 a.m. coffee, shall we?
Yes.
But it's I think that there is I think many partners seeing that commitment, behavioral commitment to change day in and day out would be, who cares if the coffee shows up at 6 a.m.? Like this is a kind thing. Nothing like this is going to happen in a narcissistic relationship. If anything, the narcissistic person may engage in whatever the behavior change being asked for a short period of time, almost as a tactic. Okay, for the past week, I've done the coffee thing. Okay, really, what do I look like? The bellman at the Four Seasons? What, you want me to bring this to you every day? And so once again, even the compassionate empathy isn't compassionate empathy. It's a transaction. It's a tactic.
Yes.
And so that's why in therapy, a lot of couples therapists make the mistake of giving the sort of reductionistic, do this, try this. And I'm like, oh God, this is
Yes.
not going to go well because it sounds like it could go quite well with a couple in which one or both members of the couple are autistic. It could go well in a healthy couple that needs a calibration or overwhelmed with children or other responsibilities. In a narcissistic relationship, I'm like, oh my gosh, you just put one more arrow in their quiver, and then that's how exactly how it's going to be used.
That's such a good point. The example that always comes to mind for me has come up in the last 10 years, which is people who are dating, and partners will often come in and say, they want me to text them every morning. What is that about? And
Hmm.
we have to contextualize that, so
Hmm.
it's like, what is the text that you're looking for? Well, I want a good morning text. Well, what does that do for you? You want me to literally say good morning? Yes, I want you to say good morning. The same way every day or different ways every day? Different ways every day. Am
Hmm.
I supposed to be funny? Like, it sounds like these are ridiculous questions. And to the person who's receiving the questions, they're like, okay, forget it. Like, I won't ask for anything ever again.
Hmm.
They get really upset
Hmm.
because it seems like the person is saying, this is stupid. This is a dumb thing. I don't
Hmm.
want to do it. But what they're really seeking to do is to understand, what does that give you? Because if you text me good morning, that feels like a demand. Now I have to text you. Now, oh
Hmm.
gosh, I have to say something funny. And what the person is really trying to explain to the autistic partner is, when you text me good morning, it makes me feel like you're thinking about me and I feel
Hmm.
loved. I
Hmm.
feel connected. So once you can make that connection, it's like, oh, okay, so I can send you a meme? Yes. Can I high five you?
Hmm.
Yes. Does it have to be
Hmm.
every day? Well, I guess not, but it feels good when you do. Oh, okay, now we have context. However, I'm sure that back and forth could be really nasty if it went down the wrong path. Where,
Absolutely.
just like,
Absolutely.
oh, okay, and so that's a great example of, if you make the connection, you will typically see that behavior continue forever, likely forever, because now it's established as a rule.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
helping clients to understand that's a path to getting what you want. Whereas I imagine with your clients, that's a path to giving you a very clear indicator that someone is not actually wanting to change the behavior.
Well, I also think that there's a struggle. I mean, I think for anyone in a relationship is that they want to believe that the person wants to do the thing that they're doing, right? So if the good morning text feels as though it is like it's like feed the dog, send the good morning text, oh, bring in the newspaper. The vast majority of people I work with would not want to think that they're on the same list as turn on the furnace.
Yeah,
That there would have to be an actual desire that I'm thinking of you this morning.
yeah.
That in a narcissistic relationship, I'm telling you now, if anyone said it would mean so much to me if you sent me a good morning text each morning, the good morning text that that person would receive is, "Hey, here's your good morning text. I hope that
Hope you're
settles your
happy.
neurosis for the day. I hope you're happy,"
Yeah,
right? So that doesn't feel good. And so
yeah.
even expressing a need can end up then getting twisted in a way that the person feels like they're asking for too much, they're ridiculous, they're childish, and the narcissistic person really doesn't want to do that thing. They're going to let the other person do it. They're not going to connect it to, I want to know you're thinking about me. The narcissistic person is going to say, well, obviously I'm thinking about you. I'm in the same house as you. How could I not thinking about you? You're lying right there next to me. So it's there's a dismissiveness.
Yeah.
And I think that dismissiveness can't be communicated about. There is no interest in that understanding of, okay, this allows me to think, know that you're thinking about me. And then that devolves into, pandemonium, really, and to absolute abuse.
Kory, you and I have talked about that kind of about that dismissiveness quality in some of the couples that you see. It, this like, well, let's see. You asked me to hang the shelf. I hung the shelf. Oh yeah, it looks really good. Oh, maybe it's a little bit crooked. So, and then the person explodes, so this, and in other words, this goes into rejection sensitivity,
Mhm.
and how that can go really wrong, in the people that you see too. It kind of looks, I think, a little bit like what Dr. Romani was just talking about. You want to go there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, autistic people are genuinely very close to rejection at all times. And there is typically, I think, at this point, I hope in another generation it won't be this way, but because so few people have, been given the supports that they need, there's a lot of trauma around messing up. There's a lot of trauma around being misunderstood or, losing friendships, people ghosting you,
Not
really.
giving people what they ask for.
Yeah, yeah, people ending relationships without any explanation and things like that. So it doesn't take much to kind of poke that rejection feeling. which is probably a form of trauma from a lifetime of, social confusion, that may be, subtle but significant enough that it's causing real damage day in and day out. So, it can be something really small, like, hey, the shelf isn't level that you hung, nothing I do is good enough, things like that. And then what you're looking at is that same defensiveness that, Dr. Ramani talks about, and kind of like, switching who the victim is and trying to have a conversation of, well, you asked for my opinion and now you're yelling at me and things like that. So I think in those situations, a person who is struggling with rejection sensitivity is not their best self. And I think that's where we get into a lot of the crossover where people are coming in saying, this is problematic. I can't share with you. I can't give you feedback. I can't tell you about yourself without this very dramatic defensive response.
And rejection sensitivity is a central core issue in narcissism, especially in vulnerable narcissism, the form of narcissism that shows up as more with more negative affectivity, social anxiety, irritability, sometimes even depressed mood. You'll see much more sullenness, a person who feels disenfranchised, disaggrieved, misunderstood. The world has been uniquely unfair to them. And there's a lot of abandonment fear. In fact, vulnerable narcissism is often considered maybe even a more mild subtype of a borderline personality style. And the two are almost impossible to discern from each other. And so that rejection sensitivity is most pronounced in the vulnerable narcissistic style. And it is a very quick shift to then playing the victim, which sounds like that the vulnerable narcissistic style and the autistic style would probably be the two that would be by far the most difficult to discern, one from the other. And so what's interesting though is that this trauma around messing up that you're describing in autistic people, this is also the lived experience of people who've been through narcissistic relationships, whether it's a
Yes.
narcissistic parent or long-term adult narcissistic relationships, because the premise of the narcissistic relationship is as long as you don't make a mistake and you read my mind, everything's going to be fine. So the partners or the children take on that mantle and say, well, that's all I got to do. If I could just devote all my resources to understanding this person and anticipating them and keeping everything perfectly ordered and making sure I have exactly what they want for dinner and never asking them something inconvenient and waiting till exactly that time on Saturday when they come home from their golf game, but not too soon, but not too late. And I ask the question at exactly the right time. So the partner in these relationships carries the entire burden of regulation, which is too much to ask in a person. Again, the other person in the relationship has their own history of rejection sensitivity because many people in narcissistic relationships also have histories of trauma.
Absolutely.
And so now the rejection sensitive person, the person in the relationship who's not narcissistic, is also now having to double up walking on eggshells to protect the fragility of the rejection sensitive narcissistic person. It's an impossible burden, and which is why we see collapse in so many survivors of these relationships.
And you bring up an interesting point because what I also see with great regularity are partners coming in who are with PDA partners as adults who grew up with a narcissistic parent. So they are used to that walking on eggshells. They are used to controlling the situation and having to be very delicate and not knowing when the next blow up is going to be. And I think the PDA adult is probably a safer version than what they grew up with, but it is still a very familiar pattern. So I do see that pairing frequently.
Mhm.
And then when they try to apply what worked as a kid, sometimes it doesn't work, even
Mhm.
though, some of the behaviors are the same. So I do
Kory,
think,
do you want to just give like a 30-second explanation of kind of the PDA
yeah.
nervous system thing that's going on? Yeah.
Yeah, individuals with PDA, it's a subset of autism that we're still really learning about, but it is an extreme sensitivity to all types of things beyond the patterns of autism that cause a severe nervous system response. So, all of the fight, flight, freeze, flop, fawning, all of those things are happening. However, they're happening in response to very, very minor, sometimes undetectable things that individual is picking up with their own neuroception. So it could be a change in autonomy. They're feeling out of control with something. They're feeling like someone is asking them to do something that they're not in a place to do. They're feeling a hierarchy where they're, I'm having to answer to someone that doesn't know more than me, and that feels off. And so in response to a lack of autonomy, in response to a change of environment or kind of difference in hierarchy, they will have a massive, massive nervous system response. And so we're just starting to really understand this in children, because we're seeing this in so many kids that are refusing to go to school and having these very, very big and scary behaviors. But I'm seeing this in a huge way in couples therapy, with couples who are coming in saying that, my partner is narcissistic. So I do think there's a lot of nuance there. But again, to go along with what Dr. Ramani was saying, there also is the part where we need to acknowledge that regardless of what's causing it, these behaviors are really unhealthy and toxic. So it puts us as a clinician in a really tough spot, because we may be working with some of these kiddos going, oh gosh, we really have to help this kid figure out a way to regulate, because this is not, going to be good long-term in relationships. We have to find ways to help them. But then when partners are coming in hearing about narcissism, they're like, my therapist told me to leave him. So we're having empathy for the kids, but we're not always having that same empathy for adults who are unidentified, because this is something we're just learning about now. So it is kind of a tough spot to be in as a clinician, to see the full picture, to understand what's happening, and maybe not know which way this should be going in terms of the way that we treat it.
And also, I think that there's also something you said here is that if therapists are telling clients to leave relationships, that's also a tweak that needs to happen in clinical practice. Because I have to say that short of there being domestic abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, harm to minors, harm to dependent adults, and harm to pets in the environment or property in the environment, it is not the therapist's place to be that decision-making authority. I have how many countless numbers of people I've walked through these relationships, and I am always agnostic as to that part of the conversation. I'd say, I'm not committed to you staying or going. I'm committed to your psychological safety, your autonomy, your individuation, and above all else, becoming very well versed with the limitations of this relationship. Because it's like you're not going to take this, you're not going to take your grandmother's car and open it up to 200 miles an hour on the freeway. It doesn't drive that way. Okay. This car is not going to go over 65 miles an hour. That might work for you. Someone else is like, no, I need that car that goes faster. This isn't this. Someone else will say, I have to stay in this. I'm saying, okay, so then we're going to do this armed with you knowing the limitations. And so but if a person says, I want the relationship to be these things, the therapist might say, this isn't going to happen in this relationship. It's just simply not. This person doesn't have the repertoire in an intimate relationship, nor, and this is the key with a lot of narcissistic folks, nor are they committed to doing the work and making the meaningful change, which is the commitment to therapeutic work. And for many narcissistic clients, that actually could be trauma-informed work where they do unpack and process earlier traumas that are impacting their behavior now. But it also means, and this is the biggest stumbling block in clients who are narcissistic, who have narcissistic personalities, is that moment when the therapist has to lift off the shell of specialness and exceptionalism and extraordinariness, and that you're just a person without a big old suit of armor. I mean, I can count on one hand the number of therapists I know who are good at that, right? So whatever change there may be, for some people, they'll say, listen, he actually comes home for dinner 3 nights a week, probably still cheating on me, doesn't yell as much. That's enough for me. Someone else will say, absolutely not. This is not what I want. So there's also a sense of subjectivity in the client in terms of what is endurable, what there's resources and social capital to be able to get through. So I do think that the idea of the therapist saying, you got to go, you have a narcissistic client, you got to go, that actually flies in the face of what we know to be best practices in this work of clinical intervention.
I could not agree more. And I think some of the statistics that I'm seeing are just horrifying. And I think these are probably well-meaning therapists who are needing guidance, who are hearing things that they're saying, wow, that's not okay. But, most of the couples that are coming to me have been, anywhere from 5 to 12 therapists for the couple. And, you can imagine what is being said in therapy when they're hearing some of the behaviors without the understanding of what might be behind them. So they are being told really inaccurate things without curiosity, without therapist curiosity. And I think that that's the place where, we can all do better to understand these patterns, because then we're helping them to get to that decision-making step. It's not our decision to make, but, something that you said that really resonated with me is, understanding the radical acceptance piece of, yes, whether it's the narcissistic personality or whether it's the autism, like these are the pieces that we can't change. This is what you're going to get. And the room for movement is going to be here, and it's going to be dependent on your partner. So where are you putting your energy, and how much energy is your partner willing to put in?
Well, that's the piece. And I also think, again, in the work I've done with clients who've been through couples therapy, more of what I'm seeing is not a therapist telling them he's narcissistic or she's narcissistic or they're narcissistic, you got to go. What I'm hearing is the person who is in a relationship where there is emotional abuse, where there is invalidation, where there is a myriad unhealthy patterns. The partner who's being harmed is more often told, well, let's try a different way to say this,
Yeah.
or they are honestly being told by the couples therapist to hold the regulatory burden of the relationship. Well, we need to let their nervous system quiet down. Well, we need to let them have a minute. Well, we need to let them soothe. And I want to pick the couples therapist. I want to call and say, what accommodation is being made for the person
Right.
who is suffering so much in an abusive relationship? I get what you're saying. Certainly all these things might make it easier for the other person, but with the too many couples therapists, the mistake is, okay, well, you seem healthier, so you do the work. We do this to siblings all the time.
Mhm.
We do this to the hardest worker in a workplace. Gosh, you get things done so quickly. Could you stay the extra hour and get it done? So that offloading the regulatory burden, it can't be that. It has to be. And that's where I'm seeing the
Yeah.
problems in couples therapy. What I see a lot more rarely is the couples therapist who says, I'm seeing narcissistic patterns. And even more rarely, and that you got to go.
So I
Interesting.
think, Kory, I think that this is a really fascinating part of your work, about just the issue of accommodations,
Yeah,
which we
I agree.
know is
Hmm.
critical to
Hmm.
for neurodivergent affirming
Yeah.
support. We need to understand what accommodations a person might need, and go and support that person in that way.
Mhm.
And in a couple, the couples you're seeing, I mean, Kory, how do you make it so that it's not one person?
Hmm.
Co-regulation is a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about what
And it can't be one person doing the work. If the
Mm.
autistic partner, is coming in and they're not willing to explore, regulation individually, then it's not going to work, because, I think for a lot of people it's preferable to co-regulate. Many autistic people have not had successful relationships
Mm.
prior to their romantic relationships, and they very quickly get married. They very quickly partner
Oh,
up
interesting.
with the first person that, meshes well. And
Mm.
neurodivergent people have a very real connection that happens really fast. And what often happens because of that, they've had no experience regulating by themselves. And so once they have that partner that is providing something to them, the relationship becomes a special interest. The relationships, soothes their sensory needs. Having someone in your space constantly, really, really
Mm.
provides a soothing effect on the nervous system, that parallel play kind of feeling. Once you have that, that's going to be the preference every time, because it works quicker. It's a lot harder to sit down with your enormous feelings, pull them apart, journal about it, process them. Most people would prefer for someone to help them with that. And I think that's where we run into trouble, is that, the accommodations need to happen individually. It's not that you did something wrong by hugging me because I'm autistic. I am not able to do touch right now. And
Mm.
until you
Mhm.
can really learn to differentiate and to acknowledge the fact that that is your need for something sensory, that is your need for solitude, your need for downtime or solo time,
Mhm.
the partner will never get that right 100% of the time, because these things are invisible. So, you do have to have a partner that wants to acknowledge, that wants to grow, that wants to learn
Mhm.
alongside the partner. Yes, we can co-regulate, and that's phenomenal, but I also
Mhm.
need to learn to do this on my own at the same
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
And I think that's the big difference, is that, when I have partners that are doing very, very well in therapy, that's why, they see it,
Mhm.
they're like, whoa, aha, this is great. It makes a ton of sense. We can work on this together, and I can work on this together.
Mhm.
And the partner is working on their own stuff.
Yeah,
I can feel a ton of empathy for my partner when he's dysregulated and
that's
I
right.
don't have access to him, and I need something. Where are you?
Mhm.
So that's something I need to work on individually as well. So there's always a system, even, if it's just two people.
So, in terms of the system and system imbalances, I think, as we're kind of wrapping up and pulling back, and then, we'll talk about like, motivation for change and why it's so important to have this conversation. But I just want to, before we go, I want to talk a little bit about power, which we know is a big thing in the narcissistic
Mhm.
abuse picture, and controlling behaviors, or what looks like controlling behaviors. Let's just go there for a little bit and see if we can't tease that apart. Why somebody who's autistic might appear to have very controlling behaviors,
Mhm.
and the partner certainly probably feels very controlled. Um, uh, Kory, do you want to say a little bit about that, and then Dr. Ramani weigh in
Mhm.
from your
Sure.
end?
Yeah.
Yeah, very often things that look like controlling a person are often controlling predictability, controlling the environment,
Mhm.
controlling a feeling that they're having in their body from overwhelm. So if I know there's a more efficient way to do something and I watch my partner do it the less efficient way, it creates a body sensation that is very unpleasant for autistic people. And I think people have this to varying degrees depending upon your presentation. But you'll hear a lot of partners say, you're driving poorly, you're cutting that up wrong, you didn't clean the counter the right way, the dishwasher's being loaded improperly. And those things, we're taught like that's never the issue in therapy. There's something behind that, but sometimes that is the issue for autistic brains. We need that predictability. We need a precise way of speaking or efficiency or things like that. And it's not typically coming from a bad place. However, when you are constantly commenting to someone on the way that they do things, what else could that feel like but control? So oftentimes we have to work on both sides of that equation where,
Mhm.
we're having to say, yeah, that's not a good feeling. No one likes to be parented by the person they're sleeping with. That's not a good feeling. And also to the person who's doing that, we need to understand where that's coming from. What is it like for you to watch someone cut that up the way that, you feel is less efficient? What's coming up in your body? And, is there a better way to communicate that? Or is there a way that you can manage those feelings so you're not taking it out on your partner? But the one thing that I think really stands out is that, autistic people are not looking to control other people. They actually are quite uncomfortable with that as a concept. Very rarely do I see that come up. And if I do, I'm looking for something else that's happening because I think fundamentally, most autistic people have a really strong sense of justice and right and wrong and morality and ethics and all of those things. And very frequently when these behaviors show up that are not appropriate and conflict and other things like that, the partner will struggle with the fact that they behaved that way and it's seen as controlling because they know, within themselves that they're not a controlling person. And often that is very hard for them to sit with.
Mhm.
So there
Mhm.
is almost no desire to control the person. It's more often
Mhm.
the environment, if that makes sense.
Mhm. I mean, and that's very interesting because I think in a big contrast, because in narcissistic relationships, the narcissistic person wants to control the environment and they want to control the person. So, control, power, domination are key motivational dynamics for a narcissistic individual because it maintains the key defenses of sort of grandiosity,
Mm,
right? So, and everything related to grandiosity, like the entitlement and all of that. So, the grandiosity allows the narcissistic person to retain this kind of perfectionistic, superior
mm,
facade, and holding control over their people is a way that that's achieved. So not only will it be the house has to be the way I want it, things have to be the way I want them, the schedule has to be the way I want them. I can also change it all at the last minute.
mm,
Nobody gets to say anything. Okay. And then obviously narcissism's on a continuum, right? All personalities are. At the extreme end of narcissism, when we're seeing very severe, more malignant patterns that are more consistent with other things like coercive control, we're going to see control over everything. We're going to see financial control, control of comings and goings. There may be technological abuse where, trackers are put on everything and cameras and all this other stuff. There's going to be control of who you can see. There's going to be isolation to maintain that the entitled sense of domination
mm,
that person has. I do not believe in the case of a narcissistic person. It is a way to manage sort of it's not a way to manage dysregulation related to the sense of I need things in order to
mm,
feel like, in other words, everything has to be just so. It's almost like, look how I have everything in control. don't mess with me. And you moved my pen, there's going to be hell to pay. Like a sense of, I can also punish you for not, playing, doing things the way I want to. And all of this results in control over everyone in the environment, who now has to live in tremendous hypervigilance to ensure that not only be prepared for the many, many last minute changes, which they're never allowed to make, by the way. But imagine, I want you to sort of think about being sort of the devil's personal assistant. That's sort of what it is to be in a narcissistic relationship. They can throw things, they can scream at you, they can change the schedule, they expect you to know what they want for lunch. But there's no sense of, I think a person might make that mistake once or maybe a few times, that they'd say to the narcissistic person, you shouldn't load the dishwasher this way, because a narcissistic person would eviscerate them. It's not worth the verbal abuse that one would tolerate. So what people will do is, when the narcissistic person is around, they'll reload the dishwasher the right way, adding to their burden of work, because they don't want to tolerate, or these become very volatile relationships where everything, dishwashers, the way the car is parked, everything becomes a screaming battle, which causes tremendous harm to other people in the environment, as well as to a person who's not ready for that. Sometimes people are just up for the fight. And especially when two antagonistic people get together, that can happen. So control, it is very much a interpersonal control coupled with environmental control.
Interesting. And I think in my case, what I would see in a scenario like that would be a debate about which way of loading the dishwasher is more efficient and why. And most of my clients will say, I love a healthy debate. Like, I would love for you to tell me why your way is better and give me research and data. And they would like to know where you're coming from. And also, I think some of the ways that things are worded, you mentioned, you're coming and going, and how that all, a lot of times it's like, what time will you be home? How long will you be gone? Who are you going to be with? And that's actually data seeking. Like, I need the predictability. What time will you be home?
But it sounds like
it sounds like control.
Just like control, because how could you not feel controlled if someone's saying, but is it 5:30 or 6? Which one is it? You might think they're saying, I don't want you out until 6 o'clock, when in fact they're saying, I need to prepare my brain for the fact that I might think you're coming home at 5:30. So what we work on, get back to accommodations, is that's fine. Like, then you need to say to your partner, I don't have a problem with how long you're out. I'm just trying to prepare my night that I'm not disappointed.
And
so could we give a range somewhere between 5 and 6:30? That you'd never see that from a narcissist.
No. And even what you're saying about the adherence to ethics, morality, and rightness, other than the sort of small subset of narcissistic people whose way of seeking narcissistic supply and exerting control is a form of self-righteousness. It's judgmentalness, it's moral superiority, it's miserliness, it's workaholism. You'll see that in the self-righteous narcissistic group, who will be very punitive financially, who will be judgmental. Well, you know what? I'm not going to, even though the person might have plenty of money and somebody's down on their luck, they got an illness, they had to go on disability, then the self-righteous narcissist will say, well, I don't really feel the need to help you because you're lazy. And the person wasn't at all lazy. They got sick. Or the moralistic parent who's cruel to a child who, for example, who might be coming out, is gay. It's like, well, we don't have that in our family. And we'll cut the child off. Like, there's a real capacity to just, boom, lower that axe if everyone's not in line. We'll see that. But even in those self-righteous narcissistic folks, they do feel like moral holy rollers. Like, they will never see any kind of flexibility. Certainly, even ethically, there might be times like, we're going to have to break this rule for a minute because it's the humane thing to do. And the self-righteous narcissistic person will say, absolutely not. And I'm going to call the authorities on you. And you're like, wow, okay, great. And so you'll see that, but it's very, very punitive. And then the narcissistic person will say, like, you broke a rule. I had to turn you in. And it'll feel like there's an absolute lack of empathy. But if the same was done to them, they would have lost their minds. Again, it's the hypocrisy.
Yes.
And it's also the sense of, for the narcissistic person, they're very quick to enforce the rules, always for other people. They expect other people to be fully following rules, but they don't feel none of those rules should apply to them. That way of thinking is, rules are great for everyone else, but I'm special. I shouldn't have to follow them. That kind of falls away from that sense of there are things that are right and wrong. Narcissistic people believe that for everyone else.
I think the last thing I want to just touch on briefly, and then I think we can talk about, okay, so now we know that there's a distinction. How can we tell that there's distinction? Is there, are there any green lights, red lights. Is this going back to the beginning, this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde? I think a common misperception of autistic people is that it's just one way all the time. But Kory, you're an expert in the high masking presentation. So can you say a little bit about high masking
Yeah,
autistic people and why it would look very different in the home, in the relationship, than it would at work, going out with friends?
very different. And oftentimes I see so many people where the workplace is where they shine. That's where they thrive because that's where they're able to connect with special interests. The workplace is full of rules, predictability. When you go to a meeting at work, you know what time it is, what time it's ending, what's expected from you, what to bring, who's talking, in what order, when it ends. All of those things are crucial to the predictability, to the social skills. I mean, all of those things are just dreamy for autistic people. We love those boundaries. At home, your wife says, I'm pissed at you. Like that could be a 3-hour conversation that you weren't planning on having that night. And you may not be in the headspace for. So I think what happens is most of the people I work with do so well in the workplace in terms of being comfortable. And not that it's always easy, but they know what to predict, they know what to expect. And then when they get home, most of the romantic relationship expectations are the direct opposite of that. And that's when they are the lowest energy after a day of being with people, after being out of the home, after all the transition of to work, home from work, sensory element of the environment, all of that. They come home really without much to give. And
Because masking itself is quite
oh,
exhausting.
man, it's exhausting. And you'll see this in kids. They walk across the street from the school where they're a perfect angel all day. And next thing you know, they're hitting mom, they're, saying terrible things. They're, kind of crawling under the covers and going to sleep for hours because it's exhausting to be in the world and to mask. So, it's very easy to see why a partner would say, you're just lovely at work. You're so funny. You're so charming. Everybody loves you. They think you're this great person. And then you come home to me and I get nothing. You don't ask about my day. You don't ask about my day. You don't ask how I'm doing, what happened, because there's not much left to give. However, it's not because they're manipulative at work. It's truly like the depletion of what the day takes from you. So, there are times when that happens at home too. A full day accommodated, your sensory stuff is going okay, it's predictable. You're going to have, the partner that is probably what they see at work, but it is very drastically different. And, I think as a person that can relate to that, like I know what that feels like. So it's really upsetting to the person as well. I don't like when I can't show up and bring my full self, when I'm depleted or I feel like I could burst into tears at any time. And so it's really unpleasant for both people. And I think what ends up happening is people are so worried that it's manipulation and that, they are married or dating someone who is a narcissist, that that's the lens that they see it through. And they're missing all of the cues of, wait, there are things we could do here to make this better. If you give your partner 30 minutes at the end of the day to just decompress, they are going to come back full force, 9 times out of 10, and be the partner you want them to be. If you can take some demands off for a half hour, help with the transition, back off for a little bit. And if you plan that into your day, it doesn't feel like you're losing anything if that's what you're expecting as the partner. So I think it's a lot of little things like that. And I think partners are thrilled once they realize there are things that both of them can do so that the time that they are having together, it feels like it's closer to the same person, if that makes sense.
Is it realistic to expect a person who's autistic to also make said accommodations for a partner?
100%.
So see, that's the
100%.
difference. That's the
100%.
difference, right? I think that if the person's saying, I need this half an hour, I need this, I need this, and then the other partner says, you know what, you do get to go out of the house for work on the weekend. I need 8 hours to go write someplace else, away
Yes.
from this. So I'm going to go someplace else. I'd like to have that. Would, that the autistic partner would say, absolutely, and you've expressed that to me. I know it's coming every Saturday from 1 to 9. You're going to go
Yes.
do this. Okay, great. And so that, again, that Jekyll Hyde quality takes on a different kind of a feel in the narcissistic relationship because there's a lot of similarity. And I think
Mhm.
though the challenge is how quickly it happens and what's driving it. So I always say what I call the dinner
Yes.
party example.
Mm.
You're at the dinner party. The narcissistic person is holding court. They are laughing. They're a raconteur. They're sharing the stories. They're offering to help with the dishes. They're flirting with the hostess. It's all the person throwing the party. Everything's great. You get in the car. You're like, we had a good time. I'm going to continue talking with them at the party. And the partner goes dark instantly and then verbally attacks the partner. Like, did you really have to bring up that time I got laid off? And you say, but you were laughing when I was bringing that up because you were so glad it happened. Like, please don't bring up my da 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 da, da, and it's instant, right? So you
Mhm.
could imagine the experience is they got the best of you, right? What is wrong with
Yes.
me? Okay. But it's it's almost immediate. And then you realize there are two behavioral repertoires here. There's one that shows up because it's getting the person the narcissistic person, validation, attention. And then in the other, the partners, I mean, whether the partner is serving a different function. It's usually a pacifier and a tool of regulation. And so the partner is considered to have to sort of endure all of the emotional abuse. And if the partner questions it, then they're immediately gaslighted. Oh, you're being so sensitive. Oh, I know. Oh gosh, God, I gave you one criticism. Here goes the baby. And so there's a meanness. There's a real meanness. And so that inconsistency drives what we call that trauma bonded state, the intermittent reinforcement of sometimes this relationship can actually be normal or great or fun or connected. Other times it's cruel, it's invalidating, and there's a sense it takes a minute. A lot of the work we have to do with clients is helping them see the signal in the noise, right? And you don't always know. It's not like, again, the way you're describing it, Kory, is that days at work are nice for autistic people because in many cases there's rules. For narcissistic people, it's a crapshoot whether a day at work is going to be good because it depends on if they got attention or praise or they
Yes.
won something. I mean, otherwise they're like, I can't believe I have to go waste my time and work with these damn clowns all day. What
Yeah.
did you do? Get to sit on your ass all day in luxury in our house? And so
Yeah.
very contemptuous. So there's not, it sounds like at some level there is more predictability in an autistic
Yeah.
relationship than there would be in a narcissistic relationship because you don't even know. And you might even say, you just had played golf for 6 hours with the people you work with. I don't even like golf. I did it to make a deal with this jerk of a CEO. And so you
Yes.
just don't know. And it's the mind reading demand. It's literally impossible. And what I'm hearing is that there's an anticipatory piece that can happen in couples work with when there's a autistic person or two, both in a relationship,
Yeah.
where you can actually unpack it and say, these kinds of guardrails, these kinds of
Yes.
behaviors, if we could put these in and keep these in, we'll be fine. In a narcissistic relationship, that's literally impossible.
And
That's not going to happen.
I think that's so interesting because I do think the guardrails almost always make a big improvement.
Yeah,
However,
no,
I
yeah.
do think in the moment, sometimes it looks pretty similar though. You know, if an
Mm-hmm.
autistic person went to work and their boss was like, I didn't appreciate your attitude in that meeting, and their nonverbals were saying something that their words were not saying, and that autistic person doesn't agree with that, I didn't experience myself that way. They might come home in that same fashion where, they're burning it down and it's
Mm-hmm.
completely inappropriate and pushing blame on the other person. And
Mm-hmm.
they may not have the interoception to recognize, oh, my body feels
Mm-hmm.
completely overwhelmed with emotion right now. I feel like I was, someone has misrepresented me. They don't know me.
Mm-hmm.
They might have the same response. The difference being once they are able to process that, they will come back and it's not about the partner. So it's coming from very different places and different sources, but
Mm-hmm.
it may be almost identical behaviors that are
Mm-hmm.
really not okay. I don't think anybody should be talking to their partner that way. But with time and understanding of what's going on there, it might be, oh, that thing is happening in my body. I need to isolate. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the
Mm-hmm.
difference, is that I don't think I would see that in a narcissistic client,
Mm-hmm.
like the
Mm-hmm.
willingness to,
Mm-hmm.
take steps to behave in a different way or improve the
Mm-mm.
situation.
No, not in a sustained way.
Hmm.
I think we've seen some, just to wrap up and then say, okay, so now what do we do? Well, we know that these two things can look on the outside very similar in terms of behaviors and in terms of what the partner is experiencing. These behaviors sometimes, are not okay for the partner. Um, so what do we do? What do we do? From your end, Kory, you've indicated there are some green, and we're talking
Yeah,
about undiagnosed
sure.
mainly, right? This is so what would you look for?
I would look for if a couple was coming in and describing some of the crossover area that we discussed today, I would want to know more about, what surrounds those behaviors. So, I want to know more about the other traits that could be, contributing to this. I would want to know, is there trauma? I would want to know what the, parental relationships look like. What does it look like with the kids? What do their friendships look like? Do they have friendships? Like all of the social stuff that would make sense to learn as a therapist anyway. But I would want to know the other things, which oftentimes people are not asking these questions in therapy. Like, what are your sensory preferences? Do you have a lot of trouble with transition? How do you feel about group work? Do you think your boss is an idiot? Tell me more about that. Do you always think your boss is an idiot? There's a lot of different dynamics that are really themed. And I think a lot of them are so predictable that even when I'm doing assessments, I often find that clients use the exact same words to describe their preferences, their experiences, their behaviors. So, you'll notice patterns of speech. You will notice nonverbals that don't match the verbal message. You will notice partners saying, oh, you can't trust their face. It never means what it looks like it means. And then intensity, if the special interests are a really big green flag to autism, if you have a partner that is obsessive about every single thing that they do, that is something to really pay attention to, because that is a tool we use in therapy for couples and individual work to understand what's going on. It's a regulatory tool. So there are a lot of green flags if autism is there. It's not subtle. If you really know what you're looking for, even if it's not obvious on the outside, if you're asking the right questions, autistic people want to be understood and they will tell you. So I do think, if you're asking the right questions and paying attention to what is showing up and what is not showing up, you will see it pretty quickly.
And you will have seen this from, if you go back in terms of history, you will have seen this from an early
Childhood.
age,
From
childhood.
the very
Mhm.
beginning. Yeah. And you can go back and, they were two, they were obsessed with ducks, and then in
Mhm.
school, they always had to be the teacher. And, they never understood why their friends stopped playing with them on the playground and things like that. Yeah. I mean, these pet now, it doesn't mean that parents noticed. It doesn't mean that parents contextualized it the right way, because we didn't know anything about this a generation ago. If it didn't look like Rain Man, it wasn't autism a generation ago. So, just because it wasn't identified and it wasn't severe doesn't
Mhm.
mean it wasn't there and it wasn't problematic. So, oftentimes I notice parents will contextualize it in a way that makes it make sense. Oh, we moved a lot. That's why they didn't have friends. Oh, they were an only child. They always hung out with adults. That was just who was around. There's always a reason to kind of make it make sense that may not be the right reason.
Dr. Romani, when we were thinking about narcissism, I don't think we would call it green flags, probably red flags. I don't know.
I mean,
What
remember,
are the flags that you're seeing? Yeah.
narcissism's on a continuum. I'm going to say that again, right? And I think the key is that let's lift out for a moment situations of severe, certainly physical abuse, other forms of, of sexual abuse, severe coercive control or any form of coercive control. Obviously, in those situations, in the long term, there's no safety, health benefit to being in those relationships, and not to say everyone can easily even leave those. But for everybody else, the therapeutic positioning, again, I'm a big believer that it be agnostic. I mean, listen, I always say that there's a therapist prayer I say after my sessions with narcissistic clients. I'm like, if there was some vaporization to get this person out of their life, like I know I recently did a consultation with someone where they said it was 47 years of a nightmare in a marriage. And then they got it, and it was very clear the partner's, antagonism, relationship ends. And she said, I'm 70 years old and I finally know peace. That's really was that simple. And she said, what's terrifying is it was always that simple. And so it can make an improvement, but we don't get to have that position that this is the only path forward. So a lot of it in the therapy is when a client comes in hot, and it's all about my partner did this and my partner did that and my partner's so mean and my partner's so abusive and would you believe this and aren't they narcissistic? They got to be. Tell me they're narcissistic. I actually will take a step back and wonder, okay, we might be dealing with something a lot more complex here. Assessment is everything. It's conceivable the client coming into the office telling you that their partner's narcissistic may have those antagonistic traits themselves and want somebody to hold up that position for them too. But what we'll often see in a client who's going through one of these relationships is they're often really, really psychologically crushed. They're like, I don't know what to do anymore. I'm done. Like I We've got kids. They are going to eviscerate me in family court. I know it. I do not want my children spending 50% of their time with this person. I don't have the money to fight this. So you'll see people who are already dealing with very well founded fears of what they're about to face in family court, very well founded fears around post separation abuse. So that's at the more moderate to severe end. At the mild end, people will say, I'm not happy. This isn't pleasant. I'm in a relationship with somebody who I'm like basically an AI robot that does things, and there's no attunement, there's no interest, there's lots of insults, there's immaturity. They're playing video games while I'm trying to run a household. There's no way to ask them to, and it destabilizes our kids too much to have the conversation. So I gave up a long time ago, right? And I think I might be to blame, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So I think that a lot of it is to give that space of validation, to not lean so heavily as, yeah, of course this is narcissism, to hear it, and then to focus on behavior, and to give them permission to say that pattern, that wasn't okay. Like what was just said to you, that wasn't okay. I am so sorry. That is hard to hear. Some of these people say, you're sorry for what? Because again, in this era, people are bringing in text messages and recordings, and you're thinking, great gadzooks, you're brokenhearted for this person who has to listen to this, and you're validating their experience like, this is hard, and this is not healthy, and this is not what a healthy relationship looks like. And then you find out what their schemas are around how they view it. Most of them are taking on disproportionate responsibility. You get at their history, you get at their childhood history, you find out the history of the relationship, and slowly but surely you build it up. And then little by little, you're working with them collaboratively on goal setting. Like, what are you hoping for? And a lot of them say they're narcissistic, I gotta go, right? I'm like, no, 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 no. What are you hoping for? That question is hard for them to answer because they've been so subjugated for so long. So it's really about, what do you hope for? And then sometimes it's unrealistic. Well, I want full custody of my kids. I'm like, that deal's off the table. Okay, so let's go back. You leave, you've lost these kids 50% of the time to this. So we do a lot of reality-based work. We help clients understand that this is relational trauma, that they are holding it somatically. Some clients who go through narcissistic relationships are dysregulated. Most are overregulated. We see a lot of numbing. We see mild dissociation. We see people who try to do everything themselves so that they don't have to interact with the narcissistic person as much. We work on building social capital. We work on building other relationships, and we work on radical acceptance. This is it. This is it. You cannot put a second story on this house. And so what now? Now that you know this, what now? And there's grief. We walk clients through the tremendous grief. Whereas what Kory does is much more focusing on accommodation and skills building. Sure, there's grief and all of that, but that's very different. Some of that's going to be sufficient. It's a long journey, and some clients will leave the partner, they'll get pulled back in. Some clients will vacillate in ambivalence for years. And our job as therapists is to support them in this process of individuation and autonomy. And at the end of it, some people leave and some people don't. But in many cases, they're just saying, I'm just glad I know what this is because I've stopped blaming myself for it. And they'll say, it's become a very superficial place, and I found other places to sort of fulfill meaning, purpose, to get support, and that the relationship is what it is, and then they, not every fairy tale is a fairy tale, and not every story has a perfectly happy ending.
Kory coined a term in one of her networker articles, grief, which is the grief and the relief that comes sometimes with an autism diagnosis. So there's grief, there's grief work, I think.
Yeah. And there's relief here too sometimes when
to be
it's
able
pretty
to name
established
it, to understand
what this is. It's a different relief because you're like, ooh. And the other problem is, like I said, we didn't even touch on it, family court and all of that. My guess is autistic people don't go completely manipulative and abusive in family court. See, that's a big, big difference. And that, I have to say, is often one of the rate limiting factors. Many people say, if we did not have children together, I would have walked out of the door years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely.
I guess as we wind up, I have one question. Can it ever be both?
Absolutely. I'm
Yes.
living proof of that. I've been in relationships where it's both. It can be both. I don't know, Kory, if you know prevalence statistics on that. And when it's both, I have to say for the people in the environment, whether it's the children, whether it's other family members, whether it's a partner, that's almost its own. We'd have to do our own hour on that because you're now talking about folks, to Kory's point, we're only in the last 5 to 10 years talking about high masking autism in, meaningful ways, right? And even thinking about it. But we have generations of people who did grow up with a person where it was a bit like, huh? And then a place that was cruel. And then a huh? And then a cruel and back and forth. And then as it became, again, I'm speaking of lived experience, it did such a number on me because I felt this tremendous pity and this tremendous actually sense of I'm a terrible person,
Mm-hmm.
but also tremendous trauma of what the narcissism piece did to me. And to this day, relationships are very fraught places for me because I'm always kind of tiptoeing between pity, guilt, grief, fears that I'm reading it wrong, fear of closeness. Because I think, imagine all of these dynamics happening at once, and you don't know whether you're reading the autism piece at one point or you're reading the narcissism piece. In my clinical practice, I think I've only worked with about 3, 4 individuals who really clearly had a partner who had both of these present. In 2 cases, it was a parent, but it was, I mean, it was one for the books. And it really resulted in symptomatology that was pretty adjacent to complex trauma in the survivors.
I would absolutely agree. And it is probably one of the hardest things to
Yeah.
work with in terms of the guilt and in terms of grief and all of the things that the partner is processing. Because I think sometimes people come in, accepting the narcissist piece of it and saying, okay, if that's what it is, then I know what I need to do. And then they find out about the autistic piece and they go, "Oof, does that mean that does
Yes.
this mean I have to look at them and erase what they've done?" And it doesn't, it does. I mean, I think that's why I appreciate your work so much is that, even with the understanding of what is happening, it doesn't erase what it's doing to the partner. So, what in any way that your body is processing, someone behaving badly, and abusively, like it impacts the partner in a tremendous way. That's never okay. Understanding the cause of that is important to see if it can change, to see if it can't change, but it's not okay. So, when I have partners coming in and it is both, I think they feel really torn as to like, does that mean that I'm supposed to feel empathy for this partner that is abusing me because autism is a piece of the picture? And I don't think there's any answer to any of this. Like you said, that's just their process and how they're unpacking this is going to be a long, long journey. So it is really tricky to pull apart, but I think we are seeing less and less of that combination. I think with more, and I think we will continue to see less and less of that combination because with more awareness of autism, earlier identification,
Mm-hmm.
assessments, accommodations, it being talked about, this is no longer the lost generation of people who were not being identified. Now, people in this generation, 30s, 40s, 20s, they're all being identified because of social media. I'm not all, but they're being identified at much higher rates. So I think they have the awareness that what I grew up with was not okay. And so it's just different. So I think we're moving in a direction where hopefully we will be seeing that less, but it's pretty common.
And just to reiterate, with early assessment, early identification comes the opportunity for skill building, and all the important tools where you don't have, I mean, I hope you always have a thriving caseload, Kory, but where you don't have partners coming in feeling abused, where you don't have people not really understanding why they're behaving the way that they're behaving,
Yeah.
and having the opportunity to behave differently. Dr. Ramani, I think in the terms of narcissism, they don't want the opportunity to behave differently. So it is important that we see the difference, understand the difference. These are two buzzwords, kind of, with growing awareness comes kind of a obfuscation, a confusion around what is actually going on. So I'm glad that we had this discussion
Mhm.
with all the nuances. I think we could go on a lot longer. Maybe we'll have some opportunity to do that down the road, but we'll wrap up for now. Anything to leave our viewers with?
No, I mean, I just really want to leave viewers with, I want to build on a piece that Kory said at the end is that, even people in narcissistic relationships continue to feel some empathy for their partners, no matter how harmed they were in the relationship. And a lot of people feel foolish. And I say, no, actually, you won, because the sense that you fully lost yourself isn't there. You feel empathy, but empathy doesn't always mean that you stay around for the abuse. And
Mhm.
I think that separating those two states, that I can have empathy for their history, for their incapacity to regulate, for the beautiful poetry they lost in life because of that low empathy. I can have empathy for that, but I don't need to stand around it. And
Mhm.
I think that helping clients hold on to that piece of it and then make their decisions accordingly is a big part of this work. And it's not always easy, because it's easier to be completely angry at someone than it is to recognize that this is incredibly complicated. But the more we stay in the gray, the more people are able to heal in a much more realistic and long-term way.
Beautifully said.
Thank you so much, Kory. And it's such a pleasure. I mean, I learned so much every time I talk with Kory. I really, really am grateful for this conversation.
I could
Thank you. Well, I hope everyone will continue to tune in to our offerings, our conversations. This is what we do at Psychotherapy Networker, is just open the door to conversations that aren't being had enough in the field. What are we missing? What are we not talking about enough? Thank you both for engaging in this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.